Let's have a look at the topic we've got tonight: Port Arthur, deceit, and terrorism. Do you know, for thousands of years, many of those in power, whether it be church, trade, media, or politicians, government, have tried to silence dissent. Indeed, if they couldn't silence the dissenters, they often killed them, or they certainly disparaged their name and their good position in society. And this has been the lot down the ages to our modern whistleblowers and others who would speak out and tell the truth as they see it. The Invrel Forum was formed back in 1988, quite some time ago these days. It's changed a lot since then. It's now a 4-day forum. And it was formed for the very reasons of silencing, of censorship, to give people an opportunity to speak out, to give people an opportunity to hear things that those in power do not want us to hear, to give people an opportunity to meet other people of similar minds, or, as it's happened at the Invrel Forum, of dissenting views. We've had a couple of debates, and we have people with strong opinions in different areas. And this, to the organisers of the Invrel Forum, has always been perfectly as it should be, because this is what freedom of speech is all about. Over the years, there have been many hundreds of speakers presenting many topics, some of them controversial, some of them extremely controversial, some of them to do with health, education, and so on. In fact, the Invrel Forum is said by many to be the leading event in Australia on matters of freedom. Do you know, it seems that any alternative viewpoint on Port Arthur is forbidden in Australia by those that would be our masters. You're simply not supposed to talk about it. You're certainly not supposed to hear what's being said. And that's why we get the dissent, that's why we get the censorship, that's why we get an attack on those who would give another viewpoint. Now, one of the things I've campaigned against personally is fluoridation. And I would far rather have a debate on fluoridation than just speak on fluoridation. I love the opportunity to go up against what is considered to be the best of science, medicine, and dentists and government people in the country, telling us why we should have fluoridation, or rat poison as it's more commonly known in the rural areas, forced down our throats. So the idea of dissent and to hear other people's viewpoint is just wonderful. Today we've got two speakers speaking on the same topic: Port Arthur, deceit, and terrorism. When Wendy Scurr first heard shots at Port Arthur, she ran towards the Broadarrow Cafe. She heard something whistle past ahead and stopped and ran into another building, the centre, and phoned the police. She had some difficulty getting across the viewpoint to police that there was trouble at Port Arthur on that tragic Sunday. She was the first staff member to enter the Broadarrow Cafe. And she's received many commendations for what she did on that day. Now, Wendy's been a Tasmanian all her life, visited the mainland a few times, and we're pleased to have her here tonight. For 20 years, she's been a member of St John Ambulance Brigade. Her role was firstly to teach others about first aid, to also look after the many first aid kits that are on the Port Arthur historical site. And if she wasn't teaching, she was working as a tour guide. And that was what she was doing on that Sunday. Wendy's going to share with us a little of the history of Port Arthur and also the location. And she said this is an important point. And then she's going to tell us what she experienced on that Sunday. Her own experiences. I asked Wendy if she felt her life had changed since then. She said totally. From a person that was on call for 100 hours a week, she has not worked a single day. She finds that she can't do many very simple tasks. Without Graham, her husband, who's here supporting her today, we don't know what would have happened to Wendy. She's suffering from post-traumatic stress, or shell shock as it used to be called in the war. And she's asked us to bear with her if she hesitates at any time through a presentation, particularly when she's asked questions. And she's happy to answer questions, because sometimes when she concentrates, it gets very difficult. Now, Wendy, in giving her experiences today, is going to give us a graphic account of what happened. And normally when I see such things in the media, you wonder why they do it. What useful purpose is served by such an horrific viewpoint? But Wendy is concerned that the same thing will happen again. She wants to get across to us what did happen and the horror of it that she experienced and many others experienced on that day. Ladies and gentlemen, to welcome our first speaker for the new millennium at the Inverell Forum 2001, let's give a welcome to Wendy Scurr.
To thank the people of Inverell and the Forum Committee for inviting me here tonight to speak. If it hadn't have been for these people, I guess my story would never have been told. It certainly was never going to happen in Tasmania. So thank you. On behalf of my husband Graham and Andrew, I would like to thank Robert and his committee for inviting us to speak tonight. Also to Mr. and Mrs. Rumming for collecting us from the airport and accommodating us, and it's very good, I might tell you. There is one other person here tonight that Graham and I met on the phone about 4 years ago, Mr. David Barton. Thank you, David, for your support. It has been a pleasure to meet you in person. Thank you also to Andrew McGregor for the work that he's put in. I'd read a lot of the documents on many occasions, and I just read over everything, but Andrew, being an ex-policeman, he had a more investigative mind than what I had. Port Arthur is a story of social engineering at its worst. This is the first time I have spoken in detail publicly of my experience at Port Arthur. Out of respect for those killed and their families, I decided my complete experiences should not be told. I am now convinced that our politicians, elected public servants and their offsiders in the bureaucracy have used this against me in their efforts to make sure that due legal process in relation to the Port Arthur massacre never happens. Comments such as, after nearly 5 years it should be forgotten, to me are an insult. You decide for yourself the possibility of me ever forgetting when I have finished speaking tonight. I haven't anything to hide, I don't sleep well at night, but I hope after tonight there are a few more in the same position, and it's not you people. They know who they are. If the cap fits, wear it. There were many heroes at Port Arthur on the 28th of April 1996. I saw the fear, the terror, and against all odds, the staff and visitors who were there give so much of themselves, more than anyone should have to in peacetime in this country. In some cases, these people had found next of kin and partners deceased or injured, but they had no choice but to keep working on. After all this effort, a lot of these people have been thrown on the scrap heap, especially the visitors. Many of them have told me that they have not heard from any Tasmanian Government department or the Port Arthur Historic Site to ask how they are for the past 3 years or longer. Although I have only had regular contact with a few visitors, there is no doubt in my mind these people would be experiencing considerable difficulty. One of these victims lost her only child that day and has had no less than 30 operations in the last 5 years. She was also very severely injured. In fact, when I hear of their problems, I feel guilty that I'm a Tasmanian. If this is the way we treat our tourists, then I wonder why they visit us at all. And if you want to read a little on this particular lady's story, it is in this week's New Idea. And her name is Caroline Lawton. To these people I say, the thinking Australians are not fooled. They simply don't know the half of it. John Howard said it would be too hurtful for the victims and their families to have a coronial inquiry, as did the Tasmanian Attorney-General Ray Groom. We're still waiting for that coronial inquiry. Without finality, how can we be expected to continue our lives? I recently remember the night I saw John Howard demanding the Australian victims in the bridge collapse at the Massacre Games be properly compensated by the Israelis. Don't get me wrong, I'm not for 1 minute saying they shouldn't have received compensation, but the Port Arthur victims from all over Australia and overseas never received any more than criminal injuries compensation, and I know many who haven't even got that. To my knowledge, no staff or otherwise have received compensation for any damages. The donated money from the Australian people was given and spent on transport burials as far as I know. I'm just going to give you a little history and just show you on the map exactly where Port Arthur is. Port Arthur was settled in 1830 and it closed in 1877. And it was once Australia's largest industrial town. They made everything there from ships to nails. There was approximately 12,700 convicts went through there over that period, and many boys. There were many young boys transported from England. There is one guy that I used to talk about, and his name was Blunston. He still has or his descendants have a factory in Hobart that makes Blunston boots. Do any of you have any Blunston boots? Well, that young lad, when he came out from England, he was a street urchin. He learnt the trade of boot making at Port Arthur as a boy prisoner. So it wasn't all that bad for them, because a lot of these boys did make something of their lives. I will talk about communication. Communication with the outside world in the 1830s, using a semaphore system, enabled a message to be sent to Hobart Town and a message returned within 15 minutes. If a phone wasn't available on the day of the massacre, I hate to think what would have happened. All other forms of communication with the outside world were hopeless. Two-way radios, mobile phones. They did it better in the convict days. The authorities had been aware of this problem for as long as I can remember. The Port Arthur site is a government business enterprise and is run by the Board of Management. Thousands of visitors arrive annually. About 90% of these visitors come from interstate and overseas. And it was about 90% of the people that were injured and killed, the same thing applied on that day, so 90%. Now we've got a map here, and I'm just going to walk over here and just show you where Port Arthur is, and Andrew will also be using this map. We have, can everybody see before I start? This is Port Arthur, and this is where Seascape was. This is where Turana was. We're talking about this quite a bit. And this is Eagle Hawk Neck. And this is the only way you can get onto the Tasman Peninsula. So you can see why they chose this area as a penal or a prison, because it was surrounded by water, and it would be an island only for this little neck of land, which is only probably 200 metres wide. They had a team of dogs on there, and they were chained together very close. And they used to tell the convicts that this place was infested by sharks just in here, so they wouldn't swim across. But that didn't stop the bushranger Martin Cash. He had to go. And then we've got this other peninsula, and this is the Forestier Peninsula. And up here we have a bridge that just, when it's open, completely shuts that off too. So you've got actually the Forestier and the Tasman Peninsula. I won't go any further with any of the others because that's Andrew's talk, but I would also like to point out the coal mines. And I would like you to see where they are in relation to Hobart. Now on Mount Wellington in Hobart, there is a tower that actually transmits all the communications. And the coal mines out here would have been the only place where the perpetrators of this massacre would have planned to leave a heroin haul, as they called it. But I'll talk more about that in a minute. So the Tasman Peninsula's southeast of Hobart. Travelling time from Hobart is 1.5 hours. That's travelling at the speed limit. The road is not very good, it's rather windy and quite narrow. My day at Port Arthur started on the 28th of April 1996. It is my own story. My life stopped that day. To best describe the feeling, it would be to say it's just like a tattoo on your brain. I feel like taking the top off my head and scrubbing until all my memory is removed. But it won't go. I only think about it every 10 minutes now. For the first 2 years it was all the time. There would be almost 500 other stories that day. No matter where you were at the time of the shootings, there are many who would feel just the same as what I do. On that day I was rostered on the ferry, the Bundina. I used to love the Bundina, going around the harbour and conducting tours. I'd done a harbour cruise early in the morning from between 11 and 11:30. Between 12 and 1 I took a group of people onto the Isle of the Dead, and that was the convict burial ground. A lot of those people that accompanied me on that tour, including the Micmacs, I found their bodies later in the Broadarrow Cafe. Nanette Micmac was very well known to me. Her father lived 2 doors from me. I nursed her mother. She died 15 weeks previously. I'm glad she wasn't alive to see the death of her daughter and grandchildren. I left the ferry at about 1:10 p.m. When I reached the outside balcony of the cafe, I noticed a young man with blonde hair staring at me. He would have known I was a staff member, as we always wore a navy uniform with a name tag. As I walked by, I nodded at him, he nodded back, and I went into the cafe to buy lunch. I went to where the staff could purchase their lunch without getting hurled up, and walked out of the side door, and I went to the information centre. It was then about 1:20 p.m, and if Andrew could just come over and do his work, like he's supposed to, and put up an aerial photo for me, I'll be able to show you exactly where I was.
Can't get good help these days.
Okay, this is the Broadarrow Cafe, and there's a lot of bush up behind these cars. It's important you remember that. I'll just walk across here now. The side door of the cafe was about here. That's where I was. So that was called the information centre. Along here there is a little gap where some people could have got out of the building and escaped, but that's to come a little bit later. Down here, the bodies are still there. There's a couple here, another one here. That was the next day. I went to the toilet, as all good guides used to do, and returned to the information office and sat down for lunch. Often I did eat in the Broadarrow, but that day, fortunately for me, it was busy. We had about 500 people there. And so I didn't sit down in there and have lunch. The shooting itself started at about 1:30. I say about because the 1:30 walking tour hadn't gone. if the guides didn't leave on time, they'd find they have no time to have 5-minute break when they came back before they'd have to take the next one. So the walking tours always went on time, and it hadn't gone, they hadn't even split the group up, so it was definitely before 1:30. And that is often disputed. I heard the sound of very, very loud bangs, and I never thought of a gun. I thought of it as possibly a gas explosion or anything but. I ran towards the cafe, and I was about 6 inches in from the side of this... Brian, you might go do that for me, where I was, sorry. About 6 feet from the side of the cafe, and I felt something fly by my head. Had no idea it was a bullet. Still wasn't thinking, actually. I thought I was having a brawl in there. I thought, well, I'm not going in there, lucky for me. And then a person came down the steps to the front of the Broadarrow, and he wasn't touching the steps. He was going over them. He was flying. And he was warning us to run. Well, out in front of the information centre, we had about 70 people waiting to go on this tour. There was a busload of elderly Americans, and they sort of didn't want to leave. They thought, gee, they do it well down here, you know. They really put on a show down here. In fact, I've lost sound. No, a little bit early in... right? A little bit earlier in the day, one of the tours had been going up to the Commandant's cottage, and just as the shooting started, there was a girl taking a tour away from there, and that's over the bay from the Broadarrow, right opposite. And when the shooter started to fire shots across their way, she went down on the ground, flat out on her tummy, with the Navy uniform on, and the American said, gee, they can't do that well. And it wasn't long. Have I got sound now? It wasn't very long, and the Americans that was with her were back on the ground. The bullets started flying. I don't think it was working very well. Sorry about this.
You can see Rob's done this before.
We're firing now. Testing, 1, 2, 3. We right? So I got the warning to run, and I just froze. And he said that the people were being shot, so I just froze to the spot. And I don't know how long I stood there, actually. It might have been a minute. But I thought, well, I've got to get in there, but I can't go in there yet. So I ran away towards where they were trying to shift the elderly tourists. And then I thought, God, if we don't let the police know, we're all going to be butchered. So I went back into the information centre, and you all can see where that is. And when I got in there, Sue Burgess and Stephen Howard were in there, and no, they weren't phoning the police, but what they were doing was very good. They were phoning around the display houses and up to the toll booth and warning them to not let any more cars in, to get the people in the area and get as many people locked up in those houses as they could. And so I ran in and I rang the police. It was 1:32 p.m. exactly, and that has been recorded. I had little trouble convincing the police officer, naturally. He wouldn't be able to believe what I was telling him, not at Port Arthur. But in the end he said, be careful, so I knew he believed me. I'd decided where I was going, the other two hadn't. So I just said, follow me, I know where to go. And then Sue, being Sue, who was always very conscientious, she said, what about the money? Well, I used the F word. The money. One of them had grabbed a two-way radio. I hadn't thought of that, and so we ran. And just as we came out of the cafe, he came onto the balcony of the Broadarrow, and he started firing shots. I've been told that he actually was firing at us, but he mustn't have been trying to kill us. I think he was just going over our heads. But the man that saved us was a gentleman at the penitentiary on a cherry picker, and he had it right up in the air, working on the brickwork. Anyway, he decided he'd better get out of there, and he started the motor up. And then he started having a go at him as he lowered it down. So we got around the toilets, and up behind the Broadarrow there's a lot of bush, and there's a bit of clear space. So we ran up the hill, and when we couldn't hear him shooting, we dived into the bush. Then we'd run again when he was shooting, because we could tell where he actually was, and when he wasn't shooting, we jumped in the bush again and laid flat. We did this 3 or 4 times, and then we heard shooting up the road. That would have been, the first shots would have been when he killed the Mikax. Then it seemed to be getting further and further away. And then we got up behind the cafe, and we found a young lady who was working in the cafe, and she was just so traumatised and frightened. She was just standing there. As we walked down the hill to go into the cafe, we took the young girl with us, and I knew we wouldn't be able to take her in there, but we found a man that appeared to us to be shot with a shotgun. He seemed to have pellets all over him, but I've been told since it wasn't a shotgun. I don't know. Finding another man who'd been shot in the head, and he had a piece of dirty rag over it. He said, "Do you want to have a look at it?" I said, "No, leave the rag there." He said, "I don't know whether the bullet's gone through my brain or whether it's just, you know, creased the skull." So that was nothing to what I was to find later. So we got these 2 men and got the young girl and got her to hide them. Now, about this time, we got a message from Ian Kingston, one of the car parkers on the day, and he said, "The vehicle's abandoned, it's still here, but we don't know where he is." So I was frightened, and I think that was the stage I peed myself. I was panicking, I was so frightened. I also knew what I was going to have to face in the Broadarrow, and having been on an ambulance for years, I've seen what gun can do. So I told the girl from the Broadarrow to take the men and hide them. Get with them and take them further into the bush and hide them. I said, "We know where you are. We'll know. Someone will come and get you. Just stay there." Sue and I climbed down the hill to the back of the cafe, and Stephen joined us. Then Sue said to me, "I wonder if the girls got out." And I said, "What girls?" They said, "Nicole and Liz." I said, "Oh God, no. Are they at work?" And she said, "Yes." Now, Nicole and Liz were, Nicole was Stephen's wife. Nicole was Sue's daughter, and Liz was Stephen's wife. They'd been married at Port Arthur only 3 years before. Nicole was 17, Liz was 25, and she'd only worked at Port Arthur for 2 weeks. And I'm thinking to myself, how do I cope with this if there's anything wrong? So Andrew, I think, put an OHP up in the cafe. I took some very deep breaths and I entered the cafe. Had to put on a brave front. There were bodies and body parts everywhere, even on the ceiling, sliding down the walls. Blood and bodies everywhere. The smell of warm blood. I knew I had to look for the girls. I had to go to the gift shop area. And both these girls were lying behind the counter of the gift shop, and both were dead. I thought, how am I going to cope for this? So, I knew as soon as I looked at them they were gone, because there was a huge blood loss. And so I put on an act, and I got down and made out I was feeling for their pulses, because they were saying, "Can you do anything?" And I just didn't know what to say. I knew they was dead, and I just didn't know what to say. I just said, "They're both dead. I'm so sorry." There was silence for a couple of minutes. I couldn't look at Sue and Stephen. I just couldn't look. I just couldn't look at their faces. They were so brave, in a terrible position. I asked them to leave and go out and help the others. They both did. Actually, Sue was in charge on the day. They put on a brave face, and nobody out there would have known what a terrible fate their girls had suffered. They continued to look after the visitors as they steadily returned to the front of the information centre. Both Sue and Stephen were highly trained in first aid because I'd trained them. This is what I had trained for myself, but never at this magnitude. When you join the emergency services, you don't expect it to be easy. I'd experienced many tragedies, but never a war zone like this. No one could be trained for this. I started to look for survivors in there, and there was only 3 left alive. The 2 men I'd found on the hill outside they'd got out, but that's actually where they were shot. I'll talk about the first person I found alive. His name was Graham Collier. He was shot in the neck. He was choking on his own blood. He was on his side. I could do nothing for him. A man's voice said, "His mouth is so full of blood." I said, "Just put your fingers in his mouth and scoop it out." This was Dennis Gabberty, a Victorian policeman. He sat with Graham while I searched for more casualties. I found out much later that Lynn, a nurse from Victoria, and you've probably read about Lynn, had gone into the cafe before me, and she'd put Graham in the side position and had actually sucked the blood from his airway with a drinking straw. Graham had his neck artery, or his carotid artery, partly clipped. He stayed conscious, and he found out that if he was able to kink his neck in a certain way, it slowed the bleeding. The bullet also grazed his cervical spine, and that's this area. The first one's down the back of your neck. And because it grazed his spine, it did something to the spinal cord, so he suffered quite a bit of paralysis even at that time. I had been trained in triage, and I knew that I had to limit the time that I could spend with Graham because I was going to lose other people. And I'd actually triaged him out of it. I'd left him to die. And I've got to live with that. But he didn't die. He lived. Graham was able to watch the gunman as he killed and wounded several people. Just before the gunman left the cafe, he was playing dead while the gunman stepped over and around him. Graham did survive that day. His life since has been similar to all of us mentally, but he suffers a lot of pain. Carolyn Lawton, she's the one that's in the New Idea this week. She was travelling with Graham and her 15-year-old daughter Sarah. She was starting to make a lot of noise. She was absolutely petrified and she would have been in agony. She was shot from the front, about here, and the bullet went straight through and put a 5 centimetre hole in the shoulder blade. It just went straight out. I asked her to be quiet because she kept screaming, and I was so frightened. I said, "He's going to come back in. If he knows he left anyone alive, he's going to come back in." So I was petrified. We still didn't know if he'd be back or not. And once again, very firmly, I had to say, "Be very quiet." She said, "Have you seen Sarah?" Sarah was a 15-year-old daughter. She said she's got a black hat on. And only a few feet away I had saw Sarah. She was killed instantly and with a terrible head wound. I couldn't tell Caroline the truth. Sarah was only 15 years old, and I think if I'd have told her then, Caroline wouldn't have lived. In fact, I wish now I probably had have, because I don't think she wants to live. A man came with some tea towels and helped me try to stem Caroline's bleeding and to keep her calmer down. I then went to look for more alive. Rob Elliott was shot in the back of the head. His left arm was severely injured by a bullet, and his wife was with him. He was in absolute agony, but she had controlled the bleeding and was trying to comfort him. Rod had tried to jump the gunman. A lot of people say, "Why didn't they jump him?" Well, Rob did, and that's what happened to him. I then moved around the cafe looking for more alive. There were none. When I arrived at the only outside door in the gift shop, I found 5 dead, a total of 7, including my 2 workmates behind the counter of this gift shop. I'll go to the map. Can you just wind it up a bit? We've brought these little illustrations because I think it's much easier for people to understand. Thanks, Andrew. When I walked into this area here, I found all these dead. In fact, these three were piled up on top of one another. They were all dead, and that was the only outside exit door to that part of that building. This was glass, and that door was glass. There was no windows in here, and just up here, there was bush. These two girls, there's two staff members, this is the counter. They knew that door wouldn't open. It was broken. And they hid there. But had that door have opened, those two girls would have led those people to safety. We call this a Hessian screen here because three ladies were hiding in behind there. Two of their husbands had pushed them in there. And and there was another lady with them as well. Now, they, I believe, was nearly last killed in that cafe. And because this was the only other exit, and that was past the gunman who was working in here, and through the front door here, it's only natural they're not going to try to go through there. And this was a long table here, and several people hid under the tablecloth there. It went nearly to the floor. But I never could get that scene out of my mind, because I tried to open that door and it wouldn't open. I wanted to get one of the men out from underneath to have a look at him, and I left him. I never had a look at him. I panicked. And I don't know, to this day, whether he was still alive. But I have been assured by the doctors that everybody died instantly. But I think they might just be saying that. So I feel very guilty over that. I didn't do my job properly. Because I thought, well, I was trapped, like they were. I was trying to get some assistance. I'll just told you that, sorry. It would have been at just about 2 o'clock by then. I walked quickly. I've lost a page. Here we are. I walked quickly to get to the phone in the office of the cafe, because in my training we'd been always told, if you've got a mass casualty situation, to please let the ambulance service know what you need. So I knew I had to go and do that. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw two Asian people sitting on their chairs, one holding a knife and the other with her finger through the cup of a cappuccino, and they had been shot straight through here. They hadn't known what hit them. It was so sudden. As I was moving to the office to phone the ambulance service, I trod on something. It seemed to crack under my feet. It was the skull of a young woman. She'd had the top blown off her head, and to my horror, when I looked down, her brain was lying in a bowl of chips. It had fell out of her head and as she fell to the floor and went into the bowl. I thought to myself then, I can't take much more of this. I covered the bowl with a tea towel. I finally arrived in the office with the phone in front of me. I dialed the ambulance station in Hobart. Peter Morgan, who I know, was in the control room that day. He answered the phone. It was so good to hear from someone who I knew immediately would have the situation under control. I must have been babbling a bit because he had to calm me down. He asked me how many were dead. I didn't really know. I hadn't done a count. He said, how many can you see from where you're standing? I counted about 12. And he said, what do you need? I said, everything you've got. I need all the ambulances you can find, helicopters, and I said, I need the police. It was just about then that Paul Cooper, another guide, he'd just finished his advanced first aid training, and he came in to me and he said, I've got too much to do, I can't help you in here. He said, I've got them at the buses, because the gunman had been to the buses. But there was a nursing sister there, her name was Robin, and so she assisted Paul at the buses. The local ambulance rang shortly after I'd contacted Hobart. They were outside, they weren't allowed to come in until they got the all clear. And I felt really happy to see them, but I didn't realise when they arrived that they'd witnessed the carnage on their way in. Firstly, the toll booth area with 4 dead and the covered bodies of the Mikacs. We now had oxygen and some suction equipment and some IV fluids, thank God. Steve Ireland asked me, and he was the local doctor down there, to go and find as many wounded as possible and take a note of their names and their addresses and list their injuries. So I had to start going around again and looking for wounded, and it was all horrible. You just couldn't get away from it. I was never so pleased, though, to be relieved in that cafe. I went to the cottage next door and I found the man there and his wife, and they were petrified, and he'd had the side blown off his face. and he had a bit of dirty rag on it, and he wanted me to have a look at it. I said, no, I don't want to see it. It's not bleeding, leave it, leave it. They were worried he might come back. I said, well, the veranda's partly covered in, just stay there. They started to look at me a little bit strangely, and I must have looked awful because I had blood all over my legs. I put my fingers through my hair, and on the backs of my fingers, as I did this, I had body matter all over them. It just fell off the roof on top of me. My shoulders, my hair was spattered. I must say at this point, there were many visitors, bus drivers and staff who all exposed themselves to that horrific scene to help out. Without their help, I'm sure the death toll would have been much higher. There was also a man making cups of tea, believe it or not, going in and out, stepping over the bodies and distributing the cups of tea around. By this time, it was nearly 2:30, the Dunalley ambulance arrived. And that's where the bridge is. But I'll leave that for Andrew to tell you about. And on board we had a paramedic. Back outside I found more casualties. Young Bridget Cook, a staff member, had been shot in the leg. And she'd tied her apron round and she said, don't you think I've done a good job? She said, I remembered what you taught me in first aid. And I said, yes, you have, but your leg's going a little bit blue. I think we've got to do something about it. So the doctor had a look at her and we decided to release the tourniquet a bit and just loosened it. By this time, people began to come out of hiding. There was more ambulances arrived from Hobart. No police yet. Only the ones that came in the helicopters, because there was always a policeman in there. I can remember one of those police officers on the helicopter going to the phone and he rang police headquarters and he said, get some effing police down here. There was nothing they could do as they were unarmed and were required to leave with the helicopter. We still didn't know where the gunman was. I was now asking myself, where were the police? It was now about 3:30 p.m, 2 hours since I'd called them, and it should have only taken 1.25 hours for a police car. I know if an ambulance can arrive from Hobart, the police should be able to do it even quicker. Visitors had evidently observed me going in and out of the cafe. They would also note that I was a staff member once again because of my uniform and name tag. I remember a lady came to me, she was so upset. She said her husband was dead in the cafe. She had no car keys or money, it was all in his pocket of his trousers. She was so desperate, she wanted me to go and collect it from her husband's body. I explained to her that was the police's work and I was sorry. But they hadn't arrived yet. I just started to feel embarrassed about it. I then had a request from a man, similar. He wanted his wife's handbag. She was dead in the cafe. And I thought, this is getting out of hand. Where are the bloody police? Just after 2 episodes, a lady told me she couldn't find her sister. She asked me if I'd seen a lady in there with black hair, green trousers, white trousers and a green shirt. I walked back in, she was there and she was dead. I went outside, I told the lady that I believed it was her sister in the cafe who had been shot dead. The only way she could identify her immediately would be to have a look for herself. I advised her not to. I said, the police will be here shortly. They hadn't come. And you can ask them what to do. I never did find out if that lady went in. Even those who had witnessed nothing were traumatised from the shock of the event. The policeman was... Oh, he'd arrived, that's right. One got there at 4:30. I'm sorry I hadn't told you that. And they dropped him in at 4:25 and they drove out at 4:30. Just dropped one off. And he was there, and all he was doing was able to collect names and addresses. He wasn't armed, and I really did feel sorry for him. We still had, probably about 400 people there. We had counted 32 dead bodies and we had about 19 injured. The situation was still so hopeless and we were helpless. Eventually the hotel sent an invitation down for the survivors to go to warmth and have a cup of coffee and something to eat. The policeman installed himself in the hotel and went on collecting names and addresses. Then Walter Mikak came to me. I had no idea what he wanted. I felt sick to the stomach when he asked me if I had seen Nanette and his daughters. I thought they would have been home by now. He told me he'd found her car still at Port Arthur. But they weren't home. I couldn't answer that question, as I know he probably would have asked me to go and look, because I'd been told there was a woman and 2 children dead up the road, but I hadn't gone up to look because I couldn't have stood that. We were very busy, and at about 5:30 we were taking the next of kin to a cottage where the CEO lived. during the week. Staff were there lighting fires to receive these people. They were also sad, and we took 2 little van loads up. So they were looked after there by the staff. And the CEO, he'd come back from the East Coast. The staff was sent away to the East Coast, the management, at 11 o'clock that morning to stay overnight. And my supervisor, Robin Cooper, said that had never happened in the 18 years that she worked at Port Arthur, but they left at 11 o'clock and they were staying overnight. When they got word, they came back very quickly. They were back before the police came, but anyway, the CEO, he was wrapped. He said, we're going to get some SOGs in soon, and they're coming in by helicopter. I was to find out later that a helicopter held only 2 young police women off the beat from Hobart. It is now 4 hours after the shooting, and we had about 5 police that we knew of, and we're still in a hopeless situation. The CEO approached me about 6 o'clock. I had to go to the hotel because there was a lot of people up there and they're starting to get sick. But the first thing I found was a young man up there with a bullet grazed atop the cross of his head. He was the fiancé of the girl who'd lost a skull. He was sitting in a chair swaying. I asked why he had not accompanied the walking wounded on a coach to Hobart. He said his fiancée was dead in the cafe and he still had not had the courage to ring her parents in Western Australia. He said he didn't know how he could do it. I was thinking those police should be doing this. I had to find a room for him. He was put on the bed and was accompanied by friends with whom they had seen travelling. A lady came up to me and told me how the gunman in the cafe had shot her husband, his brother, a friend, and left her alive to watch. It was 6:30 p.m. when a warning came from the policeman in the hotel. We're still taking down names and addresses, that there was trouble outside. I later found that the staff at a house called Cloffer, just in front of the hotel, it's used as an administration building. 5 of the staff was out on the veranda having a cigarette when 3 shots were fired right in front of them. We don't know who fired these shots. We don't know why. But they were taken back into that house. They had the lights turned out. Walter was screaming because he just found his wife and children. We had people that were traumatised the first time being traumatised the second time. We had staff that had come in to help being traumatised totally. We saw a news broadcast on television at the hotel. They said the gunman was surrounded at Seascape. So who was it? Had he escaped or was it someone else? These shots were also heard by the CEO, and he had instructed many staff and visitors in there to stay lying on the floor and keep the lights turned off. Up in the hotel, we couldn't turn the lights off. There's 200 people up there. We had a couple having chest pains. We were just getting into the hotel rooms, and it was just, I just couldn't turn the lights off. I just couldn't tell them because they would have been again traumatised. The matron of the nursing home at New Bennett, Sandra Carmichael, arrived at the hotel to help me. We were continually finding all these people unwell, and we was filling up one bed after another, and I just said, where are these ambulance people? But they were down at the Broadarrow and everywhere trying to look after the crime scene. Just after 7:30, in they come. Police from everywhere. They were heavily armed. They escorted the group from Cloffer to the backpackers hostel next to the hotel. Police also came in and was assisting our lonely policeman who did a wonderful job. Several trauma counsellors walked in from Hobart. They were treating us like children. I'll never forget these people. They had no compassion. I know a lot of the visitors obeyed. Some had no option. I have no idea what happened to these people. We sat down for a while, totally dazed and traumatised, and all of a sudden we had more to do, but this wasn't to last long. Some men who had arrived with the coroner weren't very well, and they was up at in the bar, and they were crying. They couldn't stand what they'd seen. My day finished at 1 a.m. on Sunday the 29th of April. I went home to my husband, and I fell into his arms, and I cried and I cried. I quietened down and I decided to wash myself. I showered and showered. When I started to dry my feet, there was deep cuts in it. in the top of my right foot. I didn't think at the time, but a few days later it dawned on me that I should have tests for Hep A, Hep B and HIV. Normally this would have worried me, as I had a lot of other people's blood on my feet, but it didn't seem to bother me. It didn't seem to worry me at all. A few weeks later the results came back negative anyway. Over the next 2 weeks we buried our workmates, acquaintances. There was 9 in total for us. The Mikacs in Heidelberg in Victoria, after a service at the hospital where Nanette and Walter met. And it started to dawn on us that we weren't fitting in down at Port Arthur. We were all unwell. We seemed to be kept apart. We were being separated. A Salvation Army team of counsellors from Sydney and Hobart were so helpful. Major Don Woodlands was to become a special friend to us all. I don't know whether any of you have had any contact with him, but he's a marvellous man. And I was very ago. I read a statement. We've been given a lot of witness statements, and that was one of Mr. Jim Laycott. And evidently a police officer arrived on the scene outside of the site, but he was talking to this man, and he'd witnessed, or he'd been to see the girl that was shot in the BMW. He'd seen the people shot at the toll booth, and he was there 3 minutes after. And he'd been our local cop down there for 12 years. He knew most of the guides, and he drove away. And we've never heard anything about him as far as the Port Arthur incident goes. So I found that very hard to handle, as I had him in my first aid classes. I taught him 2 or 3 courses. I don't know where we go from here, but we need help. We need, as Australian citizens, we need to know the truth. I don't know whether we ever will, but we must have that coronial inquiry, not a royal commission. And because of the display of courage and bravery at Port Arthur on that terrible day, the injured victims who were alive when they were found survived, and they're still alive as far as I know. The last thing that I'd like to say is that it has been reported that a lot of us have psychiatric conditions. We have indeed. I still see a psychiatrist. I've been in hospital many times, and in an effort to beat my depression, I've also had shock treatment. I even tried to commit suicide to find peace. This was about 14 months ago. In this, I'm not alone. We are not paranoid, and I've told you this because I think the powers that be will attack my mental state. I'm not mad, I'm just sad. I have no affiliations with any political parties, or I don't belong to any shooters.
It takes a great deal of courage for many people to simply speak publicly. To speak on such an issue and to relive those experiences indeed shows us that Wendy has the courage to speak out. Yes?
If I'm correct, can you hear me? How's that? Got it. If I'm correct, you said not a royal commission?
No.
Yes. He said no royal commission.
No royal commission, we need a coronial inquiry.
Why? Could you say why?
Yes, quite simply.
I wonder if we could leave that to Andrew a little later. Thank you, sir. Yes, next question, Chris.
Yes, forgive me, I did get here late. I've travelled a long distance, and my question relates to a report that I'd heard that there had been a rifle stuck underneath the table, and that the person, presumably not Martin Bryant, had arrived there, grabbed the gun and shot everyone from there. Did you give any report of during the shooting? Did you see the person shooting?
I didn't see the person shooting at all. Well, I'm sorry, I can't answer that. Andrew might be able to later.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, please.
I was told there was a media blackout in Tasmania immediately following the shooting, and down there people just didn't know what was going on. I spoke to someone in my immediate area, and he confirms that his parents used to ring every night after the news to find out what the latest was. Could you confirm that?
I can confirm that. There wasn't an actual media blackout, but it was what the media said was very, very controlled, and I have heard that the people on the mainland had a lot more information given than what we did.
Thank you. Yes, next question, please.
Yeah, thanks for your talk, Wendy. That was very good. The question I've got to ask is, do you have any idea at all how long the shooting went on for, in minutes? Because there's a lot of controversy about that, you see.
Thank you.
I can tell you now for sure it was 4 to 5 minutes.
Right, thank you.
Next question.
Yeah, Wendy, thanks for your presentation. Could you tell me what politicians you wrote to and what questions you asked and what answers you received, please?
Well, we've contacted every politician in Australia. A lot didn't answer, but some of the ones that did promised to do something. And then when we sort of wrote the next letter and finally put some more hard words on them and to get some answers, we didn't get a reply.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Wendy, I take it that you were not interviewed by the police about this massacre. Have you got any idea why?
I was interviewed by the police, but as soon as I got to the Broadarrow part of it, they didn't want to know any more. And I also wasn't going to be going to court if there had been a trial.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Yes, you earlier said that there were 500 people in the cafe at the time of the shooting.
No, I didn't say that. There were 500 people at Port Arthur.
Oh, at Port Arthur. Were all the people in the cafe killed?
No. There were supposedly, according to the court, there were 20 killed, 12 injured with 29 bullets.
Yep. Do you agree with the book, in principle, the book Deadly Deception at Port Arthur? Have you read the book?
I have got an article in it, but it's there's a lot I don't agree with.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Sir.
In your experience as a nurse, have you ever had any dealings with impaired mental abilities of patients, and do you think that an impaired person could have shot people like that?
Martin Bryant had an IQ of 66 and a mental age of 11, and I don't think he possibly could have carried it out in the 90 seconds to 2 minutes that the court says.
Thank you, Wendy. Next question, please.
Firstly, congratulations. You mentioned three shots very late in the day at an establishment opposite to where you were working, and it sounds like it was dark because you said you didn't want to put the lights out. And then you mentioned that the police turned up. I think you said it was later than the 3 shots, and I wonder if you'd be kind enough to relate the timing of those shots as to when you received the information that the suspect was being holed up in the other place that I'm not sure of the name of.
Seascape. The police shots went off at about 6:30. 3.
Was that police shots or 3 shots?
3 shots.
3 shots, thank you.
Sorry, I might have said police. And at 7:30, the police left Turena to come in. I've got a document saying that even the coroner wasn't allowed into Port Arthur. It wasn't to leave there until 7:30 because the situation wasn't safe. But they didn't care about all those people that we had there. And I might add, there were plenty of police, only about half an hour away. They kept them there. They didn't let them in. And I've also got some handouts here that are in the room, and they relate to some of the staff, the treatment of the staff. They're fairly self-explanatory. There is a little story there about a mortuary truck, but I'm not going to take that off Andrew, and I think I've had enough at the moment. Thank you.